Dr. Meisaء al-Baghdadi, who is going to enlighten us about how a woman is viewed by society and how she actually is from a psychological, medical, and legal points of view. But let's see who is Dr. Meisaء Jaber. Dr. Meisaء Hussam Jaber al-Baghdadi. She has completed her PhD in English and American Studies from the University of Manchester, UK in 2011. Her doctoral work examined literary representations of criminal femme fatale in American hard-boiled crime fiction in relation to medical legal work on criminality, gender, and sexuality. Now she's a lecturer at Psychological Research Center, and she teaches different modules on literature and English language to undergraduate and postgraduate students. She's also a fellow, she was a fellow in the University of Massachusetts, Boston from September to November 2013, and the recipient of fellowship in the International Visitor Cambridge Scholars, the Arab World English Journal, Rowman and Littlefield Publishers, the Canadian Review of American Studies, University of Toronto Press, Critique Studies in Contemporary Fiction, Taylor and Francis. Her first manuscript, The Criminal Femme Fatale in American Hard-Boiled Crime Fiction, came out in 2016 with Palgrave Macmillan Springer. She has published her thesis as her dissertation as a book, which really challenged the views of society about women, because, you know, in films, you've seen all how women are presented as beautiful, as killing, as, attractive in order to please man and the patriarchal society. Now, Dr. Meisaء today has another point of view to present. So please welcome her with me. Dr. Meisaء, please. The floor is yours, Dr. Meisaء.
دكتورة عفوا افتح المايك من لطفك دكتورة ميساء.
I just did. Can you hear me now?
صوت واضح تفضلي.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. First of all, I would like to say a big thank you to the College of Arts and the English department for hosting me today. I'm really honored and more than pleased to share my work with you and to be able to collaborate with you. It's really a privilege and an honor to be with you today. So and thank you for the introduction. And this is very, very, very nice of you to say these words. So I just wanna, is there something on the screen that I need to get rid of? Can you see this or this box?
Yes, Dr. Mohammed. Can you, Dr. Mohammed, تقدر توصل هذا?
Okay. Cool. So this is kind of my, it started as my PhD project, The Criminal Femme Fatale, and it went on to be a book. It went on to be a book. I have no idea why this box, sorry, so that I just.
دكتورة من عندك عفوا.
نعم.
يعني من يوم حضرتك تقدرين تشيلين المربع هذا بالباوربوينت.
I'm sorry about this. Just let me give me 1 second so that I can just restart and be able to share this with you more properly. So this started as my PhD project and went on to be a book, as you can see, that I have published at the end of 2015, and it came out at the beginning of 2016. And it's a book by Macmillan with Springer. I added another part to it, so it's not just my PhD. Actually, I wrote a second part, a whole new part. And it's, I call it my lifetime project because everything I do today is inspired by that kind of research. Most of my research today centers on female criminality, on gender and crime, on legal and medical discourses in relation to representation of women. But let's start with the femme fatale. This is where the beginning of the project. So the femme fatale is a term that circulates in literature or in cinema and in cultural portrayals of women. It's basically the femme fatale is a standard figure or a cliche in popular culture. Since Eve, we have the figure of the femme fatale. So she's there since the very, very beginning. But who is the femme fatale? The femme fatale, typically viewed as a dangerous and ravenous sexual predator who leads men into their ruination, into their destruction. The femme fatale is an old but an enduring archetype. So she's more than a stereotype, she's an archetype. She's been there since the very beginning, and we know her as the archetypal figure that represents femininity. There are different faces to the femme fatale. She comes to life in different guises: the spider woman, the evil seductress, the sexual predator. She also stands for the vampire, the temptress, the wild woman, the prostitute, and the murderess. So there are different ways in which we view the femme fatale, and these are just a few of her faces, a few of her guises. In feminist scholarship, the femme fatale is always viewed as a misogynistic construction. That's always been the case. And she stands for as the quintessential role, or she embodies the quintessential role of the bad woman. She represents the taxonomy, which ultimately reinforces the binary between the good and the bad woman. So basically, she represents the binary, the divide between good and bad, good and evil. And she always embodies that kind of bad woman persona. She's also in the feminist scholarship, and we know this since the 70s onwards. The femme fatale is viewed as a projection of a male fantasy that serves a misogynistic worldview. And in all the literature that I have read about the femme fatale in feminist scholarship, you'll always find her as viewed in that kind of in that perspective. My reading is a bit different, as I am going to explain in a minute. My reading is against the grain, if you want. So I go against feminist scholarship and look at the femme fatale from a different perspective. And I'll tell you how in a second. But basically, most of the scholarship that views the femme fatale looks at or examines the femme fatale in film, particularly film noir. And film noir, I don't know if you're familiar with the term or not, but film noir is a genre. It's a film genre that was dominated during the 40s and 50s. It's known for its cynicism, darkness, and a lot of sexual motivation. So you find the beautiful, very seductive woman going down the stairs with a, and that's basically kind of, the perfect image that sums up my work. But back to the scholarship, we are talking about the scholarship about the femme fatale. It's actually based, a lot of it is based on Laura Mulvey's theorization of the male gaze. Probably a lot of you are familiar with her work. And I met her actually in Manchester. She did a master class, and I was lucky to be able to attend and hear from her. The femme fatale is particularly in film noir. As I said, it's a projection of not just any misogynistic construction, but particularly, I should say, the post-war male desire and anxieties. So she represents that kind of, especially after the war, after World War II, I mean. So she's there to represent the male anxieties. Men came back, soldiers came back from the war, and there were a lot of disruption in gender roles at the time. So there are a lot of names. I'm just going to mention a few readings of the femme fatale, and so that I just like us I would like to share with you a little bit of the scholarship so that I can show you how different my reading is later on. So, for example, you have Janie Play's essay is fairly orthodox in its description of noir as hardly progressive. And she said that women do not resist their fates, basically. So that's one reading. And that's the image I'm talking about. This is women in film noir, and you see them, they are beautiful, seductive with guns, and you see the shadows. So a lot of it's black and white, a lot of cynicism, a lot of darkness, a lot of shadows. There are a lot of studies on that, studies on women in that particular, in that genre. Another scholar, Jack Boozer, he also observes that the femme fatale in the 40s film noir is typically viewed as an indicator of wartime misgivings about sex roles and marriage. Okay, so the femme fatale is a catalyst. She's a catalyst to men's criminal behavior in a way that encouraged the blame heaped on women's sexuality and furthered the calls for the restrictions of their roles to the household. So that's mostly the scholarship, is kind of a lot of critics focused on how this figure basically represented male anxieties and represented the disruption in gender roles and represented how she's a catalyst to that kind of criminal male behavior, the typical male behavior. And also encouraged the containment of women, because a lot of these films, I don't know if some of you have seen some of these films that are very famous movies from the 40s and 50s. These women are usually very powerful at the beginning, but they are very contained at the end. So usually they are punished at the end. So usually you will have that kind of thing. So that's why you will find that dominant reading in the scholarship about the femme fatale. Another one, Kristen Glidhill and Janie Place also talked about the binary. So there are two poles, if you want, two poles of female archetypes, the dark lady and her sister or alter ego, the virgin, the mother, the innocent. So there always women are, particularly in film and in crime fiction, I should say, they're always viewed in terms of the binary. And my reading aims at this, deconstructing that binary, basically aiming at deconstructing and taking away this binary between good and evil, good and bad, and wanting to expand the horizons of gender roles in this regard. So here, in terms of that in terms of that binary, or the polarization of the roles of women, we're talking about women on the fringes of the underworld. Okay, this is where the femme fatale falls. She is always like the what Glidhill calls the barflies, nightclub singers, expensive mistresses, femme fatales, and ruthless gold diggers. So this is kind of the bad, right? And then on the other end, you find women who are victims, wives, long-suffering girlfriends, would-be fiancés who are victims of male crimes, etc. So these are kind of the two poles, the two poles of women, the good versus the bad. Now, let me take a step back and let me take you with me in explaining where I studied this, kind of the context. So as I said, I studied the femme fatale not in any context, because you find femme fatales in a lot of literary works, but she was very dominated during the 40s, I should say, starting from the 30s, 40s, 50s, especially in hard-boiled crime fiction. Probably you're familiar with the term, but hard-boiled crime fiction, when we talk about hard-boiled crime fiction, it's a genre of a crime fiction or detective fiction that developed in the 20s and 30s and matured in the 40s and 50s. It's actually the product, it's the fruit of the Prohibition, the Depression, and the Second World War. So there's a lot going on, especially in America at the time. And it reflects a lot of the anxieties, a lot of the struggles that happened at the time. As I mentioned before, the crisis of gender identity, particularly after the war, soldiers, men went back from the war, and women were actually working, they occupied a different role. So you have Rosie the Riveter, you're probably familiar with that image, and then there was a kind of a setback, what we call a masculinity crisis and the feminine mystique. So the feminine mystique refers to Friedan's very, very prominent work that actually registered all the kind of what was going on in terms of gender roles especially in America at the time, and it talks about the crisis that happened in terms of gender roles and gender identity at the time. So hard-boiled crime fiction was born in the midst of these kind of struggles, in the midst of a lot of conflicting forces, if you want. And this is how the femme fatale became part of these kind of conflicting forces, if you want. Now, just one more, I just thought it would be funny to say black mask, because today everyone talks about masks, right? Masks are part of our lives today, but this is how it started actually. Hard-boiled crime fiction started with periodicals. So it started with not just books, not novels, but it started with magazines that were published as in installments. And the Black Mask is one of the most famous of these magazines, and it published a lot of the prominent works by famous authors of that genre. Now, if you want to just have I would say the perfect quotation about hard-boiled crime fiction, if you want just a summary of it, let me read to you what Raymond Chandler said about it. Raymond Chandler is one of the founders of that genre. He's a very famous author that continued actually very prolific as well. He wrote a lot of works, started with short stories as well as novels, but here we go. What did he say? He said, the world of hard-boiled crime fiction describes a world gone wrong, where the law was something to be manipulated for a profit and power. The streets were dark with something more than night. This is kind of the perfect image, if you want. So the streets were darker with something more than night. So there were a lot going on, more than just the crime that usually detective fiction portrays or tries to solve, if you want. Now, hard-boiled crime fiction also portrays a shift from the classical, mostly British detective story. So if we say detective story to any person, you would think, okay, Agatha Christie, right? This is kind of the first name. When I ask people, detective story, you have Agatha Christie. So hard-boiled crime fiction represents actually a transformation from the classical and mostly British detective story, in which the detective is the main crime solver. Okay, so always the emphasis when we say detective story, the emphasis is on the detective, and the events usually takes place in very fancy middle class suburban houses, libraries, drawing rooms, right? So you always have that kind of setting when we talk about the British detective story. Hard-boiled crime fiction transforms that setting into an urban space in the United States, where organized crime, gangsters, and corruption pervade the city. So these are the differences between the classical British detective fiction and the hard-boiled American crime fiction. It's often described, the hard-boiled crime fiction, it's always described as, unquote, men's genre. Now, another good quotation that also sums up the transformation of the detective story. It's you have it here. It's Americanized as unmasculinized in the same breath. So it's a very masculine and it's a very American genre of the detective story. It's a very different one from the one we have seen before, as I said, from Agatha Christie and other British writers. So the hard-boiled formula encompasses danger, deadly women, test of will, and macho personas guns, booze, and reckless bravado, and the testosterone-driven model of this hero is complete. Here you go. You have this deadly formula of not just the crime. It's not about solving the crime. It's about the psychology behind it. It's about the danger, the test of wits, the macho personas. It's about the bravado. And here you have that hero, the flawed hero, the detective is no longer the perfect kind of middle class, that crime solver. Here you have more flawed characters with a lot of darkness going on, inside and out. So how about women within this formula? Women in hard-boiled crime fiction are both a heroine or anti-heroines. So they are not just always, the victims. They're more than that. They're always perceived as, in this formula, you find a lot of dangerous women. So this is kind of was my question. Why do we find a lot of these, femme fatales, a lot of these dangerous women within this genre? And I'm going to try to answer this question today. So they're perceived as sexual predators and an integral part of that chaotic world of the narratives. And also they are beautiful and dangerous and women with a gun who by the end of the story might shoot a man dead. Again, another perfect image. So you have this woman within these stories, and I'm talking about Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, Kane. I'm going to talk later about one of the authors as an example, just to give you a better idea of what I am saying. But she's a woman with a gun who by the end of the story might shoot a man dead. And this is kind of how you can capture the femme fatale within that genre. You see a lot of these books where they were very provocative images of women, as you can see, and it basically spoke to the, as I said, to the gender crisis happening at the time, to a lot of these anxieties that pervaded society, economic as well as sociological and psychological. So there was a lot. The fiction spoke to to the events, to the struggles and the tough experiences that were happening in the US at the time. But these provocative images of women, they were put for a purpose also. So that's why I say they speak to the gender question, to use the Friedan's world, okay, to the gender question. Now, what I focused on in my study and in my research is not just the femme fatale as an archetype. I focused on the criminal femme fatale. And this is an important distinction I would like to make here. So the femme fatale, as I told you, she's an archetype from Eve, and you find it in every culture, in every literature, in every, popular culture. There are a lot of images of the femme fatale. But what I looked at in particular is the criminal femme fatale. And with the criminal femme fatale, she transgresses, sorry, you have ES here, legal as well as social norms. So she does not only transgresses, she does not, she goes beyond just the legal, but she goes also to the social arena. She transgresses legal as well as social norms by committing criminal acts for which they openly claim culpability. So these women, they go way and beyond just the legal part. They also go to the social arena, to the social transgression. She also shows the intersections between excessive display of feminine gender characteristics and their apparent deviation from typical gender roles engaging in masculine crimes. So this is how it is. She is different from the archetypal femme fatale. So she, the criminal femme fatale, displays feminine character. She's hyper feminine, if you want. She's beautiful. She's sexual. She is, very seductive. But at the same time, she also shows masculine behavior by committing criminal acts. And this is kind of the intersection, that kind of tension between these two aspects. This is where my research lies. This is where this tension is actually at the crux of my work. So another thing about the criminal fund, she challenges established sociocultural norms of passive submissive femininity. She goes way and beyond. She's hyper feminine, as I said. She is seductive and sexual, and she is female and all the, you know, but she challenges that kind of the norms of passive submissive femininity. She transgressive gender boundaries and disrupt normative sexuality, and she breaks away from the stereotype of the masculinized criminals. Okay, so when a woman commits a crime, she's usually perceived, oh, this is a male domain. Crime is a male domain, and this is how the literature kind of indicates the percentage. I'm talking about real life, right? So when we talk about real life crime, the percentage or the differences between men and women who commit a crime it's very, very high. There's a big difference between the numbers when it comes to crime. So and even socially speaking, psychologically speaking, when we talk about crime is it's considered a masculine attribute always. Okay, so the criminal femme fatale, she breaks away from that stereotype because she is feminine, because she is hyper feminine actually, and she goes way and beyond, and that's why she disrupts. She's a very transgressive figure. She disrupts normative views or stereotypes of femininity and challenges established sociocultural norms of passive and submissive femininity. Now, my work is actually, because my work situates itself within this critical studies in crime fiction, because the figure of the femme fatale, especially in cinema and especially in film noir, has been covered by a lot of critics. My work situates itself in the body of critical studies in crime fiction. So I look at the fictional femme fatale and how she is different actually from the cinematic femme fatale, and it fills in the gap in both literary and feminist scholarship by offering what I would claim as the first major study of the femme fatale in hard-boiled crime fiction. And this is how kind of I distinguished my work. It's not about femme fatale in cinema or film noir, as many studies have already covered this, but my work is actually fills in that gap and it situates itself within that body of critical study on crime fiction, but it looks at the fictional femme fatale. And the goal of the work basically is, my chief aim is to call attention to the unique ways that fiction can imagine and represent female transgression and female agency. So this is where I go against the grain. As I told you before, and I explained a number of examples, a lot of critics have talked about the misogyny and the misogyny associated with the construction of the femme fatale. What I look at is the agency of the femme fatale, and I'm going to talk about how. Okay, so I talk about that kind of tension between transgression and agency, because a lot of the critics have talked about the femme fatale as in terms of a construction to show women containment, to show punishment, if you want, for women at the end of every narrative or every film. What I do is something different. I want to argue that the criminal literary figures in hard-boiled crime fiction also open up powerful spaces for imagining female agency in direct opposition to the constraining forces of patriarchy and misogyny. So I want to look at, yes, she's part of that context where, you know, you have male authors, right? You have male authors and you have gender crisis and you have patriarchy, but I wanna read their roles. I wanna look at their, you know, what they do in the narrative, to read to read these criminal femme fatales as figures who can open up space for imagining female agency. So I focus, as I said, on a particular character type that is distinctive from the general archetype of the femme fatale. And I want to say that the criminal femme fatale uses her sexual appeal and irresistible wiles both to manipulate men and to commit criminal acts, usually murder, in order to advance her goals with deliberate intent, so and culpability. So this is how I am kind of reading her role. I want to see that how she uses her sexuality, not just to be beautiful, not just to be seductive, but actually she advances her goals. She wants, there is something beyond just the containment of women, and I want to look at that deliberate intent and the culpability of women within that kind of criminal narrative. And it's an extreme. Remember, this is, if you want to look at the like a continual spectrum of that represents women roles, particularly at the time, I'm talking about 40s, 30s, 40s, throughout the 50s, you look at a very tense era when it comes to gender roles. And I want to look at the extreme, because women were driven back home with the feminine mystique after the war, after World War II. So there was a reaction, and the criminal femme fatale is that reaction. And I want to read female agency through that. So what is agency? Just a few words. It's a problematic term. It's not an easy term to talk about, but it's a problematic term that's mobilized across disciplines, and it's available in varied and complex interpretation. But basically, one good definition that I always finding it very informing is that it's a psychological quality from which a woman derives a sense or a feeling that she can function as an autonomous, self-determining individual. And that's kind of how I view agency. Agency is always viewed against or versus victimization and marginalization. Okay, and I want to look at the roles of the criminal femme fatales beyond them being victims, beyond them being marginalized figures or just stereotypes. Women agency may have been structured around male-dominated society. Their negotiations around these structures reveal more complex and entangled situations than prevailing assumptions allow for. That is to say, I'm just saying that agency is not just, she's all there to be powerful. It is structured within a system, within a patriarchal system. It is structured within, it is negotiated or navigated through a very complex, and it's not an easy one, and a complex system where you have a negotiation of power. It's not a black and white. It's not all, she is just powerful, full stop. But there are a lot of negotiations around the questions of power and roles and the question of agency in and itself. So women agency in hardboiled crime fiction offers variable forms. So there's not just one form, but there are multiple forms, and can be found in these female characters' attempts to engage in criminal activities alongside other male criminals and gangsters. So within that world, this is how she proves to have agency. It's not an absolute. Agency is not an absolute attribute at all, but it is mobilized within limited space of the hardboiled crime narratives. So when I started reading these women, and I started reading their roles, I read those women alongside the actual criminals in real life. I spent months and months and months, I should say years probably, in the law school in Manchester researching real criminal women. I researched criminology and psychopathology of a criminal woman. I looked at a lot of the literature of how criminologists, especially feminist criminologists, look at women. What do they say about why do they commit crimes? How do they commit crimes, and etc. So my work, actually, the study of the criminal femme fatales, involves reading these characters alongside other discourses, and these discourses. To understand female criminality, you have to understand the criminology and the medical discourse around female criminals. And the approach concentrates on the representations of female criminality and engages both the feminist critiques that deal with the construction and the conceptualization of a criminal woman. So what we've got here is a lot of the discourse, or I should say the feminist discourse on criminal women in real life. It basically kind of stresses the situation that women usually are victims of the system. They are usually, when women kill, they usually kill in self-defense. When they commit a crime, they usually do it to a loved within a family context. And this is kind of the statistics of the sociology of criminal women in whether it's in the Western world, let's say. It's a short summary, but it's just that it's a summary. There are a lot of things that I can go into in this short space of that lecture. But the feminist criminologist always talks about the women as also victims of the system, and she's always boxed in within what I call the mad women, and I'm going to talk about this in 1 second. So studying criminal femme fatale along criminological and medical discourses is actually allowed me to understand these legal discourses, to understand how women are judged, to explain and control women behavior, especially criminal behavior, and also compare these knowledge economies. This comparison, it allows me to compare the ways that these knowledge economies characterize women to the ways hard-boiled crime writers depicted women in real life, and there are big differences. There are big differences here. So not just one difference, but a lot of differences actually between the way that women commit a crime in real life, or how depicted in legal and medical literature, and how are depicted in hard-boiled crime literature. So you have both ways, and I looked at these two ways, these discourses, as parallel discourses. I did not kind of I looked at them, and I kind of examined these discourses as more in dialogue rather than not necessarily in harmony. So I did not consider the medical literature, the criminological literature, as the origin from which these women are born. Actually, what I looked at the criminal women within the hard-boiled crime fiction are as parallel constructions to the women, who also images of women that are constructed within the criminological and medical literature. So, as I want to say, just an example, these violent women, usually they are constructed within criminological literature or criminological scholarship. They are judged, especially in the criminal justice system, as incoherent or discontinuous. It's always disruptive to talk about criminal women. This is not a real woman. A woman who commits a crime, she is not a real woman. She is something that is beyond the norm. And the choice of the victim and the way they commit a crime as well, they're usually considered with what we call the feminine stereotype. So, for example, the motives, usually poverty is, I'm talking about criminology, right? This is in real life. Poverty is a big motive when women commit a crime. It's rather than psychological satisfaction. So when you have, for example, a serial killer, the motive is not usually money, right? It's not usually a material gain, but when a woman is a serial killer, she is mad, she is bad, she is not a real woman. She is something of an anomaly. And this is what I want to talk about in terms of comparing, because there are also images when it comes to the construction of the images of the criminal women within that system. So the mad bad women here, it's one of these images, one of these constructions, and we talk about the criminalized and medicalized women. So the criminalized women are usually women who are law-breaking and frequently murderous women who are placed or pitted against the criminal justice system. And medicalized women are pathologized in a narrative that links her criminal behavior to a psychological ailment, to something that she has to be mad to have committed that crime. Okay, so I look at these roles and I want to deconstruct these divides and these binaries and these stereotypes, of course. And I just want to give you, this is like another 5 minutes, if you allow me, just a very quick example, because I've talked a lot of theory here and a lot of criminology alongside literature, but I just want to give you a quick example of one of the authors, and this is James M. Cain. Cain's stories, this is one of the authors in hardboiled crime fiction, and he wrote a lot of famous stories. Probably you have seen his movies, Double Indemnity, The Postman Always Rings the Twice, which I am going to talk about in a minute. He has a lot of books that are actually have been transformed into movies on the big screen. So Cain's stories are about murder and love, ones that illustrate motives, explanation rather than solutions to the crime. So instead of the crime here and you want to solve it at the end, here you have more of the motives, the psychology, and the explanation behind the crimes. With James M. Cain, you have he positions the criminal femme fatale as key character, which ultimately challenges male mastery within that narrative. And women in James M. Cain, they use sex as a weapon. So they are always instigators, as well as seductresses who lure men into participating or indeed carrying out their criminal actions. So they carry out these kind of roles. They are beyond just there as seductors, but also they are perpetrators and instigators to crimes. And female agency within Cain's stories is actually realized or identified in the convergence of women's desire to achieve economic success and their sexual power that lures men into compromising situations. And I'll give you one example. This is the Postman Always Rings the Twice. It's been made into many movies until probably one of them was by Jack Nicholson as well. This is a story that's based on that image that you can see on the right of your screen. This is Ruth Snyder in 1927. She was actually executed by electrical chair for murder. So what happened is that she collaborated with a lover to kill her husband, and she was a media sensation. That image, that image that you see on the right, that is Ruth Snyder on the electrical chair, and she was a media sensation at the time, one of the first women who was killed that way. And what Cain thought he could do, he said, well, a couple of jerks, and I'm quoting, a couple of jerks who discovered that murder, though dreadful enough morally, can be a love story too, okay? But then wake up to discover that once they have pulled the thing off, no two people can share this terrible secret and live with the same earth. They turn against each other as Judd and Ruth. This is the real life story did. So what you have here is actually a term that he came up with. It's called the love rack. Okay, and the love rack is the Postman Always Rings the Twice. It's about the very same theme that I have just told you about Snyder. It's about a woman, Cora, who collaborates with a lover to kill her husband, but at the end, he is killed. He is actually tried, and he is executed, and she gets away with murder. And that's just a very short summary of what happens. But a very good term that actually came out, that Cain himself came up with, the story is about what he calls as the love rack. It's a tortured passion between two people whose love, by some fateful act such as murder, is turned inside out, so that they begin to hate each other as passionately as they have once loved each other. So it's a love and murder, it's seduction, sex, it's a lot of sensation, but alongside it, you find it's also a story about a criminal femme fatale. The postman provides a useful lens through which we can see the female criminal, who breaks the dichotomy of the mad bad woman. She wins over the criminal justice system, she wins over her lover, she wins over everybody in that narrative. As a criminalized woman, Cora wins over the legal system and over Frank, her collaborator in the crime, and she gains the upper hand by the end over both her male counterpart and the legal justice system itself. So her agency within that context is she is very strong-willed woman, a murderous woman who exploits Frank's love, and that's the name of her lover, for criminal ends. And she proves the connectedness between economic discourse. This is her ambition. She wanted to inherit her husband so that she can open a restaurant, she can be rich, right? And sexual discourse, her sexual charm and appeal, which she uses to control Frank. And this connection is the locus of her agency. And I want to stop here and open the floor for you. I just wanted to give you a very brief example of what I have been saying all along. And I thank you very much again for this opportunity for me to share my work with you. And once again, I'm thankful and grateful. And I hope to see you again in future lectures. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة فاطمة. دكتورة فاطمة معانا؟ طيب السادة الحضور اللي يحب يسأل أو يتداخل خليه يعمل ريز هاند ويقدم نفسه للأستاذة المحاضرة. السادة الحضور اللي يحب يسأل أو يتداخل يخليه يعمل ريز هاند، موجودة علامة الكف أسفل البرنامج، يضغطها إذا يحب يسأل أو يتداخل. طيب عندنا سؤال من الأستاذة علياء ناصر. تفضلي أستاذة علياء، المايك مفتوح لحضرتك. أستاذة علياء. أستاذة علياء تفضلي.
She's mute.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Mesa, for your beautiful lecture. I'm sorry I was muted and I was out of the meeting, but I returned. Thank you for this lovely, informative lecture. It was really enriching. It was really provocative because we related, all of us women, kind of. So please,
I was about to say this too,
yes,
Dr.
yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
Yeah.
Dr. Mesa.
Yes,
Thank
please,
you
the floor
very
is yours. Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
First of all, thanks a lot, Dr. Mesa. Welcome to the virtual entity of College of Arts. You are always as enriching as I know you. My question or my comment would be, I'm just asking about the term femme fatale. Would you please elaborate on the origin of that term and how it came to being as part of the genre that you chose as a specialty in your work? Thank you very much. That's all.
So it's a French word, as you can have probably guessed from the way it is said. So it's a French word, femme, women, and fatal literally means fatal, right? So that's how it came about. So it came from a French word, literally fatal woman. And it's been used a long time, it's not something, as I said, if you talk about, for example, Lady Macbeth, and even before it, in every mythology, in every culture, in every, Eve, from Eve, right? We have a lot of these femme fatales. So as a construction, she's been there for a long time. But what I have been interested in is like, actually, when I started my research, it was, okay, I wanted to do, look at the femme fatale in mainstream, if you want, mainstream writers, okay? But once I did a lot of research, I found her, I found an influx of femme fatales during that time. And I investigated why at that time, particularly in that genre. So it came about, as I said, as a term, usually you find it in sirens, let's say, in terms of mythology, sirens in Greek mythology, those women who kind of sang, and they attracted sailors, but they killed them once they were killed because of it was that kind of image. So you have sirens, you have a lot of these, as I said, the vampire, the spider woman, you have a lot of these images that refer us back to the femme fatale, and yet in that genre she was very dominant, particularly in film noir. And I wanted to look at why. So that's why I looked at not just literature, but I looked at the criminology and psychopathology in relation to female criminality at the time, because women were struggling at especially after the war, and a lot of anxiety, masculine anxieties, a lot of gender roles, a lot of questioning, and the whole world was going through a crisis after the war. So that's why it was part of that context that I wanted to address.
So are you saying that it's a kind of, I mean this kind of image of a woman, is it a kind of a byproduct of the war, or the whole movement and let's say the revolution of feminism and what comes after?
That's before feminism. My work is before. This is particularly that. I did not. I stopped at the 60s. So my book is actually goes into Cold War, but barely. So that's kind of the thing. These are male authors. What I am saying, she is definitely part of the. As an archetype, she's there, but actually the presence of the femme fatale within that genre, within hard-boiled crime fiction, it speaks to these struggles, it speaks to the upheaval that was part of the sociological and psychological and sociological context of the time, the gender crisis, the feminine mystique, and a lot of these things. So as I think they used it, it was there. That's why feminists read her as, she is there to be contained. Because these films, if you have watched, any or some of these films, they're always killed at the end. She's always, these women, these femme fatales are killed at the end. She's punished, especially in cinema, because the visual representation of women is very strong and powerful, and then she is contained. So back to the kitchen, back, to your role. You cannot do this. Okay, so there's a lot of containment. But what I'm saying is that there is also, especially in fiction, that's why I pitted the cinematic femme fatale against the fictional femme fatale. There is more to her role than just containment. I read her agency. Although it's an extreme representation of agency, and yet it is there. And that's why I'm saying, yes, she is a lot of actually critics, if you want to look at it, wrote about the femme fatale in relation to World War II. But what I looked at is more of the construction of these images within the criminological discourse and the medical discourse at the time. So I went back and I looked at books from the 50s about criminal women, criminological books, legal books. And it was not very easy because there are not many books about, not many books at the time. Funny enough, the first book that was written about criminal women was in, I think, 1897. And they basically counted moles. They looked at the features of women, and it is funny. It was just ridiculous how women criminality was. It's always very evil because it is against the norm. But what I'm looking at, actually, there is a lot of agency beyond that construction.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. That's very important.
Thank you, Dr. Alia.
Good luck in your book.
Anyone other person who wants to ask a question? Raise a hand, please. So let me ask you, Dr. Meisa, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. Does this image of the femme fatale echo a fear inside man? Because we know that these novels are all written by a man.
By men, yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
by
yeah,
men.
yeah.
So,
yeah, sure. That's kind of.
Are they fearing that women might, at a time, rebel against the authority of man?
Yeah, I mean, definitely when we talk about the femme fatale, male anxieties, and that's the term is that's how you said fear. The term that is often used is male anxieties is definitely part and parcel of that kind of discourse. So there's always that's as I said, she is a reflection of that male anxiety, especially after the war, because when women during the war, probably you know this, right? During World War II, they were in factories, they worked, they filled in masculine jobs. They were at their best because men were fighting at the front in the war, and men and women did not just housework. They did not do anything like they did more than that. They were in factories, they did the job, they ran the house, and they ran everything. So once men were back, there was that imbalance. So in the 50s, what you find that the feminine mystique, there was a movement about driving women back to the kitchen. So if you see these ads from the 50s where the domestication of women, go back to the kitchen, go back to the kitchen. So yes, male anxieties is definitely at the heart of that representation of the femme fatale. I mean, this is always the case, as I said, since forever. But in particular, I should say, within that context of the film noir, where women containment was emphasized, and kind of back to the kitchen kind of movement, if you want.
So basically, your work is also part of the feminist work.
It is. I align my work with the feminist work, but I go against the grain, if you want. So my reading is not just about, she's a misogynistic construction, she's part of the male fantasy, because that's what the feminist critics say. They say that she is a misogynistic construction, she is there to be contained, that she reflects male anxieties, and she is basically a male fantasy. Okay. But I say, okay, but there is more to her role than this, and that's why I read her agency. I read her role, her criminality, as actually a drive for agency. These women commit a crime like men, so they do not commit a crime as just in terms of fear or in terms of poverty or in terms of abuse. And that's what the criminology tells us about criminal women in real life. These women commit a crime to like men, to gain something, to have money, to have success, to have to fulfill their ambitions, to be successful, etc. So they are like men. So that's why they challenge, as I said, they are transgressive and very subversive, very subversive in the way they challenge gender roles.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone? Any other question? I think no one is asking any questions, any further questions. Dr. Sana?
I think so, yeah.
Dr. Sana,
well, I just wanted to thank you
Yes.
Dr. Meisaء, for this informative lecture. It's wonderful, and you are inspiring, and you are a source of inspiration as ever. The first time I know you, you were great, and now you are doing very, very, very well. Thank you very much for responding very quick to my call, and thanks to everybody who attended this lecture. Thank
It's really my
Dr. Meisaء.
pleasure to be reunited with you, and again to have this opportunity to present my work. And I look forward to doing more in the future together. So I am honored to be
Inshallah,
part of the
Habibti.
English department.
Especially that we are having in Iraq nowadays lots and lots of examples of femme fatale, so it is important to
I don't think they are, but yeah. Sure.
Yes, there are.
It opens the floor for more of a provocative discussion about gender roles, at least.
Yeah.
Sometimes, Doctor, يعني literature is prophetic. It foresees the future. Perhaps these writers foresaw the future, or they themselves created another stereotype other than the traditional one, and they made it real.
Literature challenges us to think outside the box, and this is always
Sure.
what I tell my students. It's not.
But sometimes it is devilish.
It's not just about foreseeing the future, but it's also challenging what is out there, to look out beyond and way beyond. About it goes to the extreme in some sense, and particularly in that sense. I'm not saying coming out is a good thing.
Sure, no.
But
man was the first Cain, and now we have another a female Cain nowadays.
It's always been demonized as the one who brought the fall of man. So it's nothing new. It's not a new thing.
It's only a fall. It was not a deadly thing. Yani.
Well, a lot of people say she is the cause of the fall of man. That's a big. It is huge, especially I would say in a Christian theology. So it's not. It's not so she's always been there. She's always demonized as the one responsible for that kind of. But
this spiritual desolence. Yes.
It's a spectrum, so it's not the black and white. I look at it as even in terms of agency, it is negotiated within a limited space in these narratives, and it gives us the key to rethink and reconsider. Conceptualization of gender roles within that context and within that kind of narrative.
Yes, Doctor, they all the time consider women as a gender thing. It's only the soul, the soul is not gendered. The body is. And it is a social thing that there is a man and a woman. We are all the same. This is it.
Yeah,
Yes, this is it. People won't understand this. Yes, thank you very much. Yes,
Dr. Fatma, it's an irony that only women do understand that. Men never admit that.
Sure, it's against their rules.
The only difference is in the body. It's not in the soul, not in the mind, not in passion, not in anything else.
No, we are all the same.
It's a physical difference. That's it. Nobody.
Well, I'm not with this, because if we say gender is construction, is the social construction, then we have to do that. So it's not just about men do not understand that. It is more of how we view gender roles in a society in that particular context. I'm not with kind of men.
It's a cultural thing.
Personally, I'm not with that kind of divide. I'm more of let's rethink these kind of established stereotypes and established norms, and let's do in terms of society. Let's just rethink these kind of stereotypes, and let's rethink these roles to what suits us the best.
Yes.
دكتور
خلوا في بالكم انه ترى احنا اغلبيه حاليا بالمحاضره عندنا فقط 3 أو 4 رجال.
Yes, Dr. Alia, please.
Dr. Meisaء, I just wanted to ask, since you said that most of the novels that you tackled in your book were written by men.
Men, yeah.
and you are a woman who is tackling this topic, and that's quite a challenge thing to look at works written by men as a woman. How do you think they were fair in dealing with the material, and how do you think they have given the voice, the right voice for their women?
I didn't look at the, I am a firm believer in the theory of the death of the author. So I looked at the narrative and the, it's not about a man and a woman, you know, there has been a transformation even in crime fiction. I'm the first to admit that, in terms of the feminist crime fiction that came about in the 70s, when women started to write detective stories. For sure, this is a hardboiled crime fiction, is a male, at the time it was a male dominated genre. I'm not the one to argue about that, but as a critic, I look at the narrative, not the author. So I don't look at like the author did this or said that because of his personal life. And I teach this to my students. I always tell them, you know, one of the first things I teach them about the death of the author, that you have the authority to reread the text. You have the authority to kind of discover things within that text. Having said that, I would definitely, it's a very, very good point, Dr. Alia, that you have brought, that this was the one that I read. These texts that I read, they were part of a male-dominated genre. And I read these women against that kind of, I pitted these women against that genre. So that's also, that was part of the, that was part of the, if you want, the strength of the work, because these are not, you know, women, these are not texts written by women, but by men, and at a very critical time post-World War II, especially, I mean, right before the war and after the war, I should say. And so it gave me the opportunity to reread the text within a new lens, if you want.
Thank you very much, Dr. Misa. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Habibati.
Thank you very much, Dr. Misa.
All the good luck
Thank
in
you,
your
Dr.
work.
Alia.
Thank you so much for this, and I look forward to seeing you all in future.
Inshallah, inshallah.
Thank you again.
May we collaborate again and again and again. Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Misa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a lovely evening. مع السلامة.
You too. Have a lovely evening too.
Thank you.
Bye.
مع السلامة. Bye.
Okay, مع السلامة.
مع السلامة للجميع.
Have a good night.
Thank you, you too.